The horse shrieked, not a startled whicker, nor the anxious snort of a beast merely unsettled, but a raw, desperate cry that tore through the heavy air of the fenland. It resonated with the discordant clang of a bell struck out of tune, a sound that vibrated deep in Theron Hollowfen's chest before his mind could grasp its source. He hauled back on the reins, his knuckles white against the leather. The dapple-grey gelding beneath him plunged, its powerful forelegs flailing against the dense, blinding fog. They struck nothing but the empty air, then landed with a jarring thud on the invisible road, a path swallowed entirely by the last quarter-mile of encroaching mist. And then she materialized. At the very edge of the track, where the packed earth softened and yielded to the marsh, stood a woman. Her clothes were mere rags, so saturated with water and peat that they appeared to be an extension of the fen itself, a living shadow against the muted landscape. Her face, a pale oval, lifted towards him. Her mouth moved, shaping words that were lost to the oppressive stillness. He strained, listening intently, but the silence was absolute. No wind stirred the reeds, no rustle disturbed the heavy air. Only the slow, rhythmic drip of water from unseen leaves and the profound, almost suffocating quiet of the fog settling over the flat, dark waters. Yet her lips continued their silent dance, forming sounds he could not perceive, and her arm rose, stiff, unnervingly deliberate, pointing with an unyielding finger towards the western passage. The low road, the very route his coachman, eager for speed, had advocated. Then, as abruptly as she had appeared, the fog claimed her. Not a gradual fading, not the deliberate retreat of a person walking away. She was simply gone, absorbed back into the vaporous shroud, as if the very air had decided she had never existed. The gelding beneath him shuddered, its muscles rigid, refusing to take another step forward. Theron remained in the saddle, the silence pressing in, thick and heavy. The damp, earthy scent of peat enveloped him from all sides, a primal aroma that spoke of deep, ancient ground. Somewhere in the unseen distance, he caught the faint sound of water, not the gentle murmur of the familiar channels, but something deeper, more insistent, bearing the weight of accumulated mass, threatening to breach its bounds. Without conscious thought, he guided the horse, now moving with hesitant steps onto the high road. He did not yet comprehend the peril that had awaited him on the low road, the danger the woman's silent warning had averted. He could not have known that the spectral figure had remained nameless in the living world for 124 years. He would, however, come to understand both these truths. He would learn them from Celestine Witchwood, and she, with her sharp mind and keen observations, would reveal that the fen does not relinquish its secrets without purpose, that sometimes what it holds has been waiting, patiently, for precisely this moment, for one man who would finally pause and truly listen. 3 days before the horse screamed, Celestine Witchwood arrived at Hollowfen Manor, perched on the back of a carrier's cart. Her trunk was lashed securely behind her, and her notebook already lay open across her knee, a testament to her immediate engagement with the world around her. She had begun meticulously recording the fen's characteristics the moment they left Ely. The sheer unrelenting flatness of it struck every newcomer. The land's absolute refusal to rise, stretching out endlessly under an immense sky. This boundless, heavy expanse of sky occupied 3/4 of her vision, pressing down on the water channels that ran in perfectly parallel lines, as far as her hazel gold eyes could discern. Willows, gnarled and ancient, stood at intervals along the banks, their lower branches gracefully skimming the surface of the drainage ditches. Their reflections were so sharp and still in the dark water that it was often difficult to tell where the tree ended and its mirror image began. Celestine had grown up in Norfolk, steeped in the landscape of fens. She understood their peculiar beauty, their subtle dangers. She also knew what they guarded, the stories of a drowned ox, perfectly preserved for 30 years by the peat, emerging almost unchanged. The miracle of seeds germinating after 2 centuries of submersion. The deep, stubborn histories that the saturated ground simply refused to release, holding them in its cold, damp embrace. She closed her notebook with a soft snap as the manor finally came into view. Hollowfen was not a sprawling estate, as ducal properties often were. It sat on a slight rise, the only discernible elevation for miles, nestled behind an avenue of willows whose trailing branches barely cleared the ditch below. The stone was dark, a deep, somber hue, further darkened by decades of fen damp clinging to its surface. The windows were narrow, like watchful eyes. The entire structure appeared compressed, as if the land had pushed in from all sides for 2 centuries, and the house had learned to hold its shape through sheer, unyielding defiance. A flag of somber grey flew from the east tower, limp in the still air. Celestine had accepted the position 4 weeks earlier. Companion to Lady Meredith Hollowfen, the Duke's widowed aunt, who had penned a precise letter requesting a young woman of sense rather than sentiment, one who could read French, had no objection to walking in wet weather, and did not require a great deal of external entertainment. Celestine's reply had been equally direct. She read French, possessed waterproof boots, and had, she assured Lady Meredith, been quite capable of entertaining herself since the age of 7 without assistance. The position was hers by return of post. The butler, Morby, met her at the door, a figure of quiet authority. He possessed that particular quality of stillness, a composed gravity that develops in men who have watched a household for many decades and concluded that commentary is, in almost every case, entirely unnecessary. He was at least 60, with a face so composed it seemed to have been arranged, sculpted by years of silent observation rather than merely lived in. He led her through a hall lined with ancestral portraits, their painted eyes following her passage, and then up to her rooms. They overlooked the South Channel, and were, to her pleasant surprise, far better appointed than she had anticipated. Lady Meredith received her in the library, a room heavy with the scent of old leather and parchment. The lady herself was 65, perhaps older, with a spine as rigidly straight as a candlestick. Her eyes were the colour of the fen water outside, that particular pale, reflective silver that seemed to absorb light without quite mirroring it. She still wore black, a sombre testament to her husband who had died 7 years prior. She regarded Celestine for a long moment, her gaze unwavering before finally speaking. "You were smaller than I expected from your letters," she observed, her voice dry and precise. "My letters were not large," Celestine replied, a faint tremor of amusement passing through her. Lady Meredith's expression shifted, a subtle softening around her lips that was not quite a smile, but certainly acknowledged the existence of such a thing. "Sit down, Miss Witchwood. There is tea. I will tell you about this house." What Lady Meredith imparted was a carefully curated history. The manor had been in the Hollowfen family since 1642. The east wing had flooded twice in living memory and was, therefore, never used in winter. 3 water channels flowed through the property, all regulated by a complex system of sluices requiring quarterly inspection. The current Duke was 33, unmarried, and spent the majority of his time in London, though he was expected back within the week. What Lady Meredith did not impart, Celestine sensed, was everything else. "The staff will undoubtedly have told you various stories," Lady Meredith added, setting down her cup with the precise, practiced movement of someone who has performed the same action at the same table for 40 years. "Fenland has always generated stories. I find the empirical approach considerably more useful." "And what does the empirical approach tell you about Hollowfen Manor?" Celestine asked, her gaze meeting the older woman's. Lady Meredith looked out the window, her pale eyes sweeping across the muted, shimmering landscape of the fen. "That the water," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "is always closer than it appears." Theron arrived on the 3rd evening, not with the gentle rumble of an expected guest, but with a sudden, jarring urgency. Celestine was in the library, utterly absorbed. She had discovered a series of county survey maps from the 1780s detailing the fen drainage tucked away on the lower shelves. She was comparing these antique charts against her own recent methodical observations when the disturbance erupted in the courtyard. It was not the carriage she heard first. No, the horse came first, its agitated snorts and the clatter of its hooves on the cobblestones. Then the groom's voice, raised above its usual respectful pitch. Finally, Morby's footsteps crossing the main hall at a pace that was not quite running, but certainly hastened. She moved to the window, drawn by an unspoken premonition. The courtyard below was awash in the flickering, uncertain light of torches, struggling against the early autumn dark. In the center, A man sat astride a dapple-grey gelding that was still trembling, its powerful flanks dark with sweat despite the cool, crisp air. The man dismounted with a fluid grace that required no assistance. He stood for a moment, one hand resting on the horse's neck, his head lowered, speaking in a voice too quiet for the distance to carry. As he spoke, the horse's trembling noticeably eased, its breath coming in less ragged gasps. That was her first indelible impression of Theron Hollowfen, a man who could quiet a frightened animal with a mere touch and murmur, even before he had removed his own travel-stained coat. She stepped back from the window, a thoughtful expression settling on her features, and returned to her maps, though her focus was now subtly altered. She met him at dinner. Lady Meredith, ever mindful of propriety, insisted on the formality, even though there were only the three of them, and the vast table was designed to seat 14. He was taller than she had estimated from the courtyard below. His frame broad and imposing, ink-dark hair worn slightly longer than current fashion dictated, framed a face marked by a strong, almost stark jawline, the sort that suggested a history of resolving arguments by means other than mere speech, and not always unsuccessfully. A pale older scar traced the outer edge of his left brow, a thin line that spoke of an old injury, perhaps from glass or stone, rather than anything deliberate or self-inflicted. His eyes were hazel gold, not simply brown, nor merely green, but something rich and complex in between. They shifted subtly in the candlelight, deepening and warming as the evening progressed, like amber held up to a flickering flame. He was unfailingly courteous to his aunt, his attention unwavering. He asked Celestine 2 direct, probing questions and listened to her answers with an absorbed focus, never once attempting to complete her sentences or anticipate her thoughts. He did not, however, offer any explanation for why his horse had arrived in such a distressed condition. After the second course, Lady Meredith, citing her need for evening rest, excused herself with a graceful nod. The silence that settled between them was not empty, but possessed a palpable texture, a weight that hinted at unspoken thoughts. "Your horse was distressed," Celestine observed, her voice even. He looked at her, his hazel gold eyes holding her gaze. Something behind his eyes seemed to reassess her, taking her measure with quiet intensity. "He was," Theron agreed, his tone measured. "I grew up near the Norfolk Broads," she offered, allowing a hint of her own experience to color her words. "I know that fen animals sometimes refuse roads that are flooding. Is the low passage flooded?" A beat of silence stretched between them, thick with his consideration. "It was," he said finally. "By the time I turned back and took the high road, the water was over the markers, rising swiftly." "For you took the high road on your own judgment?" she pressed, noting the careful wording of his previous answer. He reached for his wineglass, his fingers circling the stem, then set it back down without drinking, a subtle tension in his posture. "I wonder," he said, his voice low, "what you know about this house, Miss Witchwood, and what you have merely been told." "Very little of either, I confess," she replied, her composure unruffled. "I have been here but 3 days." "Then you haven't heard about the woman in the fen?" Celestine kept her face perfectly still, betraying no flicker of surprise or curiosity. "I have heard nothing about a woman," she stated, her voice calm. He turned his head to look at the window. Beyond the glass, only impenetrable dark lay. The fen had vanished entirely into the night. But he looked at it anyway, with the fixed intensity of someone consumed by a persistent, troubling thought. "She appears in the fog," he said, his voice a low murmur. "At least that is what the groom's boy claims. The kitchen girl swears she saw a figure at the South Channel bank last autumn, standing in the water up to her knees at 4 in the morning." "And tonight?" Celestine asked, her gaze steady on his profile. He looked back at her, his expression serious, the hazel gold of his eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Tonight she stopped my horse on the low road," he said, the words carrying the stark economy of a man, describing something that had reached into him and profoundly rearranged his understanding of the world. "And she pointed toward the western passage." "Away from the low road," Celestine clarified, connecting the pieces. "Away from the flooding, yes." "What did she look like?" "Ragged," he said, a faint shudder passing through him. dark clothing utterly soaked through. She could not have been warm. The cold must have been an agony. Her mouth was moving, yet I heard nothing, only the water's murmur and the rustle of the reeds. She pointed, and then she was simply not there. She walked away? No. She was simply not there. Vanished. Celestine slowly set down her fork, the clink of ceramic against porcelain echoing slightly in the quiet room. "Your Grace," she said, her voice dropping to a serious tone, "how long has she been seen?" "Morby," he replied, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaping him, "has worked at this house for 23 years, and he heard the stories from the man he replaced. The tales, it seems, are older than any living memory." The east passage of Hollowfen Manor ran between two sets of tall, narrow windows that, in clear weather, offered commanding views of both the south and western channels. In the thick, encroaching November fog, however, they showed only an endless canvas of muted grey, pressing in from all sides. The family portraits, sombre and dignified, lined both walls of the passage. Celestine had asked Morby if she might examine them, expressing a particular interest in the historical depiction of the fen. He had regarded her with his particular arrested composure, his expression unreadable, and replied that the family portraits were not restricted, but that the east passage grew notoriously cold toward evening. She brought a lamp, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching shadows. The earliest portraits were rendered in the stiff, formal manner of the 17th century, figures posed rigidly against dark, somber backgrounds, their clothing pressed into severe, formal silhouettes. Their expressions carried the quality of people who had been told not to move for a very long time, their gazes fixed and unyielding. She moved through them methodically, a scholar tracing a lineage, each duke in succession, his stern visage immortalized. Wives posed beside them where marriages had been recorded, their silks and laces hinting at fleeting grandeur. Children, often diminutive, occupied the lower corners of the canvas in small formal attitudes, their presence a quiet assurance of continuity. She found it in the fourth portrait from the eastern end, a woman alone, painted in the style of the 1680s. She stood at the edge of something that was unmistakably meant to be the fen, executed in the flat, slightly incorrect way that artists rendered landscape before they had truly learned to observe and capture its nuances. The woman was not the central subject of the composition. She was smaller, set to the left, almost an afterthought, and the paint itself was subtly different. Another hand, another date, a distinct texture to the brushstrokes. She had clearly been added to an existing canvas, a later insertion. Someone with deliberate intent had inserted her. She wore dark clothing, simple and unadorned. Her right arm was extended, a gesture that immediately drew Celestine's eye. Celestine brought the lamp close to the lower edge of the canvas, its light illuminating the aged surface. In small, careful letters, almost lost in the darkening varnish that came with age, she deciphered a single name: Elspeth. Nothing else. No surname, no title, no year. Just that one stark name. Celestine stood in the penetrating cold of the east passage, the lamp's warmth barely touching her. Elspeth had been painted into a portrait that was not originally hers. Someone had wanted her in the record, had insisted on her presence. Someone had gone back, years after the fact, and meticulously placed her there. She heard Theron's measured step before she saw him, the slightly deliberate tread of a man accustomed to navigating poorly lit spaces at night, his presence a quiet disturbance in the cold air. He came to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. He looked at the portrait, his gaze settling on the figure of the woman. "You found her," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "Is this her?" Celestine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." A pause, heavy with unspoken implication. "I've walked past this canvas 100 times since childhood. I never truly looked at the woman to the left. She was added later," Celestine explained, her professional eye detecting the subtle discrepancies. "The paint technique is different. The craquelure pattern doesn't match the rest of the canvas. Someone came back to this portrait and painted her in, long after its original completion." His jaw tightened, a subtle clenching of muscles she observed in profile, stark against the lamplight. "In 1693, he said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. A woman was drowned in the Hollowfen Manor. Celestine waited, a stillness settling over her as she absorbed his words. My father mentioned it once when I was young. A tenant or servant. The records are incomplete, deliberately so perhaps. Accused of witchcraft by men who wanted her land. The third Duke did not interfere with the proceedings, did not offer her protection. He should have, Celestine said, her voice firm, a quiet indignation simmering within her. Yes, Theron agreed, his own voice carrying a weight of regret. He should have. They stood together in the cold passage, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows. Their gazes were fixed on the painted arm, extended in its permanent, silent gesture of warning across the centuries. If she has been seen at the edge of this property for decades, Celestine mused, piecing together the fragments, appearing in fog, pointing people away from flooding channels, then she has been trying to protect it, Theron finished, his voice hushed, the implications settling between them like the fog outside. Someone drowned her in this fen, Celestine said, the words stark in the quiet. And for over 100 years, she has remained, a persistent echo in the landscape. He turned to look at her directly for the first time in their conversation, his hazel gold eyes holding something unguarded, the expression of a man who had meticulously maintained a controlled distance from certain truths, and had just had that distance abruptly closed without warning, a vulnerability she had not seen before. To warn one more Duke not to drown in the same water, he said, the question laced with a bitter irony. Or, Celestine said, her gaze unwavering, to warn the right Duke about what is happening to the water right now, to this very fen. She saw the woman the following afternoon. The fog had thinned, dissipating into a soft, muted light, a gauze rather than a dense wall, allowing the world to regain some of its definition. Celestine had ventured out with her notebook and a measuring rod, intent on recording the drainage channel depths, a project she had proposed to Lady Meredith, who had accepted it with the particular approval of a woman who immediately recognizes useful occupation when it is offered. She began her methodical survey at the South Channel. The water level there was normal, flowing steadily. The channel walls appeared solid, well maintained. She recorded her measurements with precise pen strokes and then moved west along the bank, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. At the junction of the south and western channels, she stopped abruptly. The junction sluice, a sturdy wooden gate structure designed to regulate the flow of water between the two channels, had been recently disturbed. The wood at one hinge bore fresh scarring, a pale, raw mark of tool contact where the weathered grain had been cut away with deliberate force. Weather, she knew, did not leave marks like that. She crouched, her body low to the ground, to examine the damage more closely. Around her, the fen was utterly still. That particular profound quiet of flat land enveloped in mist, where sound seemed to be absorbed before it could travel more than a few feet. A reed shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. She turned, her head snapping up. At the far edge of the western bank, 30 yards across the flat ground between the channels, a figure stood, dark clothing, ragged with wet, clinging to a gaunt frame, one arm extended, not pointing at Celestine, not pointing at the sluice, pointing down instead at the ground between the junction sluice and the main drainage channel, where the earth showed a long, slightly irregular seam of disturbance, the kind of mark left when something has been dug and then hastily, imperfectly refilled. Celestine looked back at the figure, her breath catching in her throat. Gone. She stood up slowly, her muscles stiff, a chill working its way up her spine. She looked intently at the ground where the figure had stood only moments before. The soft fen earth around Hollowfen held water with tenacious grip and faithfully showed every impression, boot prints, bird tracks, the passage of small animals, with perfect fidelity. There were no footprints, nothing. Celestine's gaze returned to the disturbed earth the spectral figure had indicated. She walked towards it, her steps deliberate, her mind racing. She found the more significant damage 40 minutes later, her apprehension growing with each step. The main drainage sluice at the base of the western passage, the great timber and iron structure that regulated the entire property's water management, the key that kept the low road passable, that ensured the western fields remained above flood level, had been compromised at its very foundation. Not by age, for its timbers were sound, not by weather or subsidence, for the surrounding ground was stable, but cut, precisely with patience, a deliberate weakening that left the structure outwardly standing, but irrevocably altered its capacity to hold back a sustained inflow of water. If that crucial sluice failed during a period of heavy rain, the Western Passage, she realized with a sickening lurch, would flood within hours. The low road, the very road Theron had been riding 4 nights ago when the fog had rolled in, ran directly through the lowest point of the Western Passage. A man on horseback on that road when the sluice gave way would have had very little time indeed, perhaps no time at all. Celestine thrust her measuring rod into the mud with a decisive gesture and turned, her heart pounding with a sudden urgency, to find Theron. He believed her immediately. She would note this afterward, the swiftness of his conviction. He looked at the sluice, his hazel gold eyes scanning the precise cut marks. He crouched in the thick mud of the channel bank, his good riding coat already stained, and accepted what she showed him without requiring her to argue for it, without a single question of doubt. He ran his thumb along the cold, raw edge of the cut mark. "Deliberate," he said, his voice flat, the single word heavy with grim understanding. "Yes," Celestine confirmed, watching his expression. He stood, mud clinging to his knees. He did not appear to notice the grime, his focus entirely on the implications of the damage. "Who benefits?" he said, his gaze sweeping across the flat, muted expanse of the fen. "From Hollowfen Manor flooding?" "Someone who wants the land at a distressed price," Celestine supplied, the economic logic clear. "If the drainage fails catastrophically, restoring the estate would require capital the current income would struggle to provide. A buyer could acquire it for significantly less than its true value." "Or," he said, his voice dropping, the implication chilling, "someone who wants the Duke drowned in the flooding and the estate thrown into contested succession." Celestine had not thought of that possibility, the personal malice lurking beneath the financial motive. She thought of it now, a cold knot forming in her stomach. He led her to the estate office, a room off the main hall that perpetually smelled of old paper, dry ink, and the faint, waxy scent of tallow candles, and spread the heavy land records across the polished table. "I have a neighbor," he said, his voice devoid of inflection, a deliberate choice not to let any emotion betray itself. "Silas Drew. He has been acquiring land along the northern fen margin for the past 4 years, Theron continued, his finger tracing a line on one of the maps. 12 separate parcels. When 3 of his acquisitions bordered Hollowfen drainage channels, there was a legal question about the right to modify the drainage infrastructure. Was it resolved? In my favor. Drew's solicitor filed 2 objections, both of which were denied. He found a letter in the second drawer of the desk and laid it on the table. Drew wrote to me afterward, read it. Celestine took the letter. It expressed profound sympathy for the burden of maintaining aging drainage infrastructure. It offered, as a matter of neighborly generosity, to purchase the Western Passage fields at fair market value, thereby relieving the Duke of a costly and troublesome obligation. It was phrased so carefully, each word meticulously chosen, that on its own it could be defended as entirely reasonable. And yet the total impression of the letter was the precise opposite of generosity. It oozed calculated avarice. "This was 18 months ago," she said, folding the letter with a crisp sound. "Yes. And since then, someone has been systematically compromising your drainage." He moved to the window, his back to her. The fen lay outside, unbroken and muted under the afternoon light, holding everything it had ever been given, every secret, every sorrow. "Elspeth," he said quietly, the name a whisper in the quiet room, "drowned here in 1693. Celestine set down the letter. The pieces were beginning to fit, forming a mosaic of historical grievance. "Drew's family," she said, a new line of inquiry opening. "Do you know how long they have been in this district?" He turned to look at her, his hazel gold eyes sharp. "Find out," she urged. He went to the bottom shelf, pulling out a heavy, leather-bound volume of district conveyance records. He flipped through the brittle pages, his finger tracing entries. The Drew family had first acquired land in the Hollowfen Fen district in 1692, 1 year before Elspeth was drowned. The silence in the estate office was the kind that settles, thick and heavy, after a fact of a particular undeniable weight is set down, altering the very air. "She was warning," Theron said, his voice flat, not a question but a dawning realization. "She has been warning every duke since," Celestine said, the tragic truth unfolding. But the third duke didn't stop it, and none of his successors understood what she was pointing at. Until tonight. Until she stopped a horse on a flooding road, and the man on that horse came home and told the truth of it to someone who happened to know how to read a drainage channel. He looked at her across the width of the table in the lamplight for a long, searching moment. His gaze was intense, a silent acknowledgement of their unexpected partnership. "We need to find whoever is doing this," he said, his voice firm with renewed purpose. "We need to catch them at it," Celestine said, her resolve matching his, "which means we need to repair the sluice visibly and then watch it." They repaired the sluice the following morning, employing 3 men from the village and making no particular effort at discretion. The work was loud, the sounds carrying across the flat fen for miles, unimpeded by any natural barrier. Hammers struck wood with resounding thuds, wedges were driven in with sharp cracks, and new timber groaned as it was fitted into place. Whoever had been watching the drainage works, and someone had definitely been watching, precisely enough to know when each cut could be made and when it would go undetected, would know by nightfall that the sluice had been restored. Celestine told Theron exactly that, her voice calm and analytical. "They'll return tonight or tomorrow," she predicted, her gaze sweeping the horizon. "Before the next rain. The rain is coming in 3 days." He looked at the sky. It had the particular loaded quality of an October sky in the fens, not yet threatening with immediate downpour, but dense, heavy, pregnant with unspoken moisture. "How do you know about the rain?" he asked, a faint note of curiosity in his voice. "The birds," she said simply, "and the subtle, earthy scent of the water, a deeper tang in the air." He had, she noted with a small internal satisfaction, stopped questioning how she knew things. This tacit acceptance had occurred on the 2nd day of their collaboration, and it had made working with him considerably more efficient, freeing them from unnecessary explanations. They waited at the western bank that night, wrapped in thick dark wool, positioned carefully in the reeds 30 feet from the sluice, where the deep shadows of the bank gave ample cover. The fog, a swirling, damp presence, began to roll in around midnight, muffling the world. Theron sat close enough that she could hear him breathe, slow, controlled, the steady rhythm of someone who had held very still in difficult, dangerous places before. The fen was perfectly quiet, an almost absolute absence of sound. A heron moved once, its wings a soft rustle somewhere to the north, a fleeting disturbance. The water, however, carried its constant low murmur through the reeds, a ceaseless, ancient voice. At 1:30 in the morning she heard footsteps, not stumbling or hesitant. These were careful, practiced steps, the deliberate tread of someone who knew the bank intimately and had walked it many times before. A figure emerged from the swirling fog, moving with purpose, carrying a bundle of tools wrapped in dark cloth. He was well dressed, his attire surprisingly fine for such an illicit errand. He moved directly to the sluice, his movements betraying the certainty of a man who had made this particular journey more than once, perhaps many times. Theron rose from the reeds without a word, a silent, imposing shadow against the fog. He said very quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command, "Don't." The figure froze, his hand already reaching for the sluice. He looked at the Duke of Hollowfen, standing on his own drainage bank in the thick, swirling fog at 1:30 in the morning. The calculation that ran behind his eyes, a desperate assessment of his predicament, took approximately 3 agonizing seconds. He dropped the tools, the muffled clatter barely audible in the damp air. The man's name was Croft. He was Drew's land agent. He was 51 years old and had been in Drew's employ for 9 years, a long and dedicated service to deceit. He admitted to having made 2 previous drainage modifications at 2 other properties before Hollowfen, both of which had subsequently flooded and been sold at significantly reduced prices to Drew's agents. He said all of this in front of Morby and the head groom Bartley, who had been positioned further back along the bank, emerging from the fog like silent witnesses. He said it because Theron told him that the alternative was to wait, cold and alone, in the estate office while a rider went to Ely for the magistrate, and that the magistrate in Ely was an old friend of the Hollowfen family who took a particularly dim view of deliberate sabotage. Croft, faced with such a stark choice, chose to speak. Drew was arrested at his property 4 days later, the weight of the evidence against him undeniable. His solicitor arrived from London 2 days after that, only to find the case against his client considerably more formed, more damning than he had been led to expect. The evening after Drew's arrest, Celestine found herself unable to sleep. This was not unusual for her. She had never been a reliable sleeper, a trait her father had attributed to an excess of active curiosity, and her mother, with a fond sigh, to an excess of strong tea. She lay in her room above the South Channel and listened to the ceaseless murmur of the water moving below, and the faint, particular stillness of the fen at night. It was not silence exactly, but something more considered, a quiet hum of life and history. At 2 in the morning, unable to find rest, she put on her coat and slipped outside. The fog had returned, a silent, pervasive presence. Not the heavy, blinding fog of the night she had watched the sluice, but a thinner, more ethereal version of it, a gauze rather than a solid wall, softening the harsh edges of the willows and laying itself flat across the channel surface so that the water seemed to float suspended in nothingness. She walked slowly to the edge of the South Channel. She did not know what she expected to find, perhaps only the familiar comfort of standing near water at night, a sensation that had reassured her since childhood, offering a sense of grounding. She stood for a long moment, breathing in the damp, peat-laced air. On the far bank, the woman stood. Not the dark and dripping figure of urgent, desperate warning, though the clothing was the same, still ragged and sodden, as if the fen had been part of her for so long that the distinction no longer mattered. Something in her aspect had profoundly changed, a palpable shift in her presence. Her arm was at her side, no longer extended in a silent plea. She stood looking across the channel at Celestine, and it was looking, truly looking, not in the way that something without eyes merely appears to gaze, but in the way that a person looks when they have been waiting, patiently, for the correct moment to simply be seen, to be acknowledged. She looked at the manor, its dark silhouette softened by the fog. She looked at Celestine, a deep, knowing gaze. Then her head tilted slightly. She looked at something beyond both of them, some point that Celestine could not locate, could not measure, could not possibly record in her meticulous notebook. Then she slowly raised her hand, not pointing, not warning. Her palm open, fingers together, a gesture so ordinary, so profoundly human, so specific in its meaning that Celestine felt it reverberate in the center of her chest before she even had time to fully understand it. And then she was gone. Not the abrupt, jarring disappearance of before. She went the way the fog goes when the morning finally comes. Not suddenly, but all at once, a gentle, inevitable fading, and without regret. A profound sense of release permeated the air. Celestine stood at the bank, a chill seeping into her bones that had nothing to do with the cold. She heard Theron's measured step behind her. He had seen from his window that her coat was missing from the hall hook, and he had come out without his own, his concern a silent presence. He came to stand beside her, his warmth a comforting anchor at her shoulder in the damp, cool air. She was here, Celestine said, her voice soft, almost reverent. He said nothing, only stood, his gaze fixed on the empty bank. She didn't point this time, Celestine continued, her words a quiet recounting. She raised her hand, flat, open, a gesture of peace. In the fog, the water moved in the channels with its slow, constant voice, the same voice it had carried for 124 years, through all the cold and the damp and the endless waiting. She stayed, Theron said quietly, the weight of the words immense. For all that time, Celestine said, the enormity of it settling over her. Standing at the edge of the property, warning everyone who came too close to the low road when the water was coming, warning every duke when something was wrong with the drainage. She paused, a new understanding dawning, and none of them truly understood what she was warning about. She was warning about Drew's family, Theron said, his voice firm with certainty, or what they represent. The same action, the same type of taking, of dispossession, that drowned her in 1693. She wasn't protecting the dukes out of loyalty, Celestine said, a clarity in her tone. The third duke didn't deserve loyalty. She was protecting the fen, her fen, the land that was hers when they drowned her to take it. She was protecting her own. He was very still beside her, absorbing her words, the deeper meaning of the haunting. "And now?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. Celestine looked at the empty space where the woman had been, a profound sense of closure in the air. "She raised her hand," Celestine said again, the simple action carrying a world of meaning. She did not have better language for what she meant, for the complex emotion the gesture had conveyed, but she thought he understood anyway. A shared understanding passed between them, unspoken but deeply felt. They found her name in the conveyance records of 1694, tucked away in an obscure legal dispute. Not under her own petition, she had been drowned before she could file one, her voice silenced prematurely, but under a disputed acquisition record. The Drew family of that year had attempted to claim a parcel of fen land on the grounds that its owner had died without heirs and without formal documentation of title. The parcel, by a twist of fate and legal wrangling, had been absorbed into the Hollowfen estate by the ruling of the second duke, not from principle, likely, but from an existing property dispute with the Drews that predated Elspeth entirely. By sheer accident or by the stubbornness of competing claims, the land had passed to Hollowfen rather than to the men who had drowned her to take it. She had been standing on her own land this whole time. Elspeth Ware, the faded record read, tenant of the Western Fen margin, deceased November 1693. Theron read the line twice, his finger tracing the ancient script, the implications sinking in. "She has been standing on her own land," he said, the words heavy with the weight of centuries of injustice. "Yes," Celestine said, her own voice hushed. He was quiet, a stillness that had substance, a profound depth of thought. "I want a stone cut," he said, his voice firm, decisive, "at the western bank, with her name." Celestine looked at him, a flicker of emotion in her hazel gold eyes. "That's not nothing," she said, acknowledging the significance of the gesture. "It's not enough," he said, his gaze fixed on some distant point, "but it's what I can do. It's a start." The Drew case went to the Ely Assizes in the new year, a grim reckoning. Croft's full detailed testimony was entered in evidence, along with the land records, the damning letter, and meticulous documentation of 2 previous drainage sabotages at properties Drew had subsequently acquired. The case also disclosed that Croft had known the low road was flooding on the night Theron arrived, that the timing of the sluice work had been deliberate, and the night had been chosen specifically, with lethal intent. Theron heard that part of the testimony in Celestine's presence. He said nothing for a long time afterward, his jaw tight, his hazel gold eyes distant. The stone was cut by the village mason, its surface smooth and unyielding. It was set at the western bank before the first heavy snows came, a silent sentinel. The words were cut deep, deep enough that moss and weather would have to work harder than usual for decades to obscure them. Elspeth Ware, of the Hollowfen Fen, 1693, who stayed when no one else did. In the weeks that followed, no member of the household reported seeing the woman at the channel's edge. The spectral figure had, it seemed, finally found her rest. The groom's boy, a sensitive lad, said the South Channel felt different now, lighter somehow. He could not explain what he meant, the feeling too subtle for words. No one asked him to try. They simply nodded, understanding. Theron did not return to London that winter. He told his solicitor that the estate required his immediate and full attention, which was in truth entirely accurate. There was the ongoing Drew case, the extensive drainage restoration, and various matters of land management that had been deferred during months of dangerous distraction. He did not, however, mention the other reason, the one that could be found most mornings in the library, with a steaming cup of tea and a county survey map spread across the table, meticulously recording the water levels in the channels with the same methodical care she brought to everything else she did. Lady Meredith watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had known, when she composed that peculiar advertisement, exactly what kind of companion Hollowfen Manor and its duke truly required. She said nothing about what she observed, her gaze sharp and knowing. She had always been very good at saying nothing about things that did not need to be said, allowing events to unfold according to their own natural rhythm. In January, heavy snow came and covered the fen in a silence so complete, so profound, that the manor seemed to exist entirely outside of ordinary time, suspended in a timeless, hushed world. The channels did not freeze. They never froze entirely at Hollowfen, the water moving too steadily beneath the surface, and in the evenings the candles burned long, casting a warm, inviting glow. The library, in particular, held the comfortable warmth of a room that has been deeply occupied by people who have no particular desire to be anywhere else, their presence a quiet, shared contentment. Theron came to the library late one January evening and found Celestine still at the table, utterly engrossed. She was working through a fresh batch of old conveyance records she had borrowed from the county archive, her pen moving across the page. She was reading the history of the fen, parcel by parcel, year by year, trying to find what else it held that had not yet been given back, what other stories awaited their rediscovery. He sat down across from her, his presence a quiet anchor in the room. She looked up, her hazel gold eyes meeting his. "I have been trying," he said, his voice low, a hint of vulnerability in its tone, "to determine how to say something to you that is not complicated in what it is, only in what it implies for a number of practical arrangements." Celestine set down her pen, her full attention on him. "Then say the uncomplicated part first," she said, a soft smile gracing her lips, "and we can address the practical arrangements afterward." He said the uncomplicated part, his gaze unwavering, his voice a quiet confession. She was quiet for a moment, her breath catching almost imperceptibly. "The practical arrangements," she said, her voice a little softer, "are not in fact very complicated at all." Outside, the fen lay white and still under its blanket of snow, a landscape of hushed beauty. Silas Drew was convicted at the Ely Assizes in March of that year, his schemes brought to a definitive end. His land agent, Croft, received transportation for 7 years, a grim sentence. Drew himself, once the 2 previous sabotages were prosecuted and added to his crimes, received 14 years in prison. The 12 parcels he had acquired along the northern fen margin were subjected to a thorough review of title that stretched through the following summer, their ownership finally rectified. The Hollowfen estate was restored in full, its future secured. The drainage held, strong and true. Elspeth Ware's stone stood through that winter, and every winter after, a permanent fixture in the landscape. The carved letters were deep enough that 40 years of fen weather, wind and rain and frost could not soften them or erase her name. The western channel ran without obstruction, its waters clear. The low road was passable in all seasons, its dangers averted. What had remained in the fog for 124 years had found in the end what it had been patiently waiting for. Not absolution, for the men who owed that were 2 centuries dead, and the dead cannot be compelled to account. Not apology, for that too was beyond reach, but acknowledgement, which is the one thing that truly remains after all other remedies have expired, after all other hopes have faded. A name, finally set in stone at the edge of her own land. A woman who had stayed in the fen remembered. The fen kept that too, the fen keeps everything.